Okay, excellent. All right, yeah, so I'm here to talk about a fast way to scale. And I imagine for some of you, maybe even a lot of you, when you see this title, you think, well, haven't we talked about scaling enough already? There are well-known approaches to scaling. I'm not going to mention any of them, but some, supposedly very safe ways to scale, perhaps. And and they're popular, they're well known. So haven't we talked about scaling enough? And the elephant in the tar pit is that ultimately scaling is a problem of coordination. When we want to work, and let me be specific, when I'm talking about scaling, I'm talking about having more people work on a single product or portfolio. So having those people work together on the same product or portfolio is fundamentally a problem of scale, of coordination. And particularly, it's a problem of coordinating around code. We've got these immensely complicated collections of machinery with all these lines of code, and they all have to work together perfectly. And if we're going to work together on a single collection of stuff, we need to coordinate that work. And we particularly have to coordinate the code. And unfortunately, the most popular approaches to scaling don't really acknowledge that code exists. It's not central to their worldview. Code is not what they're talking about. So yeah, we still do have to talk about scaling because coordinating around code is the fundamental problem, and it doesn't get discussed enough. I have been working with organizations doing scaling work for many, many years now, over a decade. And I've seen a bunch of different approaches to scaling and coordinating around code. And probably the most common and still the most popular is component teams. That's where we have each team being responsible for a particular technology. We've got a front-end team, a back-end team, a user experience team, a database team, an ops team, which for some reason is called DevOps these days, which is a complete perversion of the term. But we've got each of these teams is responsible for a particular technology. And the problem with this is that when we want to ship anything to our market, we now have to coordinate all of these different teams. We have to get the front end team and the back end team and the user experience team and the database team and the ops team all working together at the same time. And that's true of every single feature we want to deliver. And so it results in what you see on the screen here. This is a real diagram from a real company. Every card in this picture represents a team. Every arrow represents a dependency where that team cannot do its work unless the team it's pointing to does something for them first. And as you can imagine, that leads to a lot of bottlenecks. Ultimately, there's going to be some team that everybody is depending on, and they are going to be hating life because everything that needs to be done is bottlenecked on them. And particularly, they're going to have this big problem of what do we do first? What ends up happening in practice is that that team is really ineffective because they're spending all their time trying to manage the many demands on them, as well as get their work done. So that's component teams. It's a very common way of approaching the scaling problem, the coordination problem, but it's not a very effective way of approaching it. Another way of approaching it, which I've used to good effect for many years, was originally called feature teams. I called it full ownership teams, but these days, I think the popular book on this topic is called Team Topologies, and they call it stream-aligned teams. But whatever you call it, the idea is a team that fully owns a particular part of the product or market. And they have people with all the skills and abilities needed to successfully deliver to that part of the product or market. And this is what I tend to use. This is the technique I used at the company I showed you the picture from before, and it makes a huge difference. It is very successful, but it's still not perfect. The fundamental problem is that your typical team in these organizations is going to be 5, 7, maybe 9 people. And that is simply not big enough to put somebody from every specialty that's needed on the team. In order to deliver, you need front end, you need back end, you need user experience, you need database, you need ops, you need security, you need all these things. And you can't put one person who specializes in each thing on every team. The teams aren't big enough. And even if they were, you probably don't have enough people. Like you don't have enough user experience folks to put one on every team. You don't have enough security folks to put one on every team. One company I worked with, they did a lot of machine learning stuff. They did not have enough data scientists to put one on every team. So what you end up doing is you sort of start with the idea of we want to create full ownership, stream-aligned teams, but then you kind of, mess it up a little bit. You say, well, we're going to have a specialist team that's going to provide support. We're going to have a platform team, which is going to enable this kind of behavior. You end up with all these supporting teams, and the pure idea of we're just going to have a team that owns a particular part of the product breaks down. Something else that happens, actually, Jade and I were talking about this just a few days ago. Something else that happens is that these teams tend to get very tightly tied to their part of the product. But in order to deliver successfully, you need to create a cohesive vision and a cohesive set of features that affect maybe multiple parts of the product. So how do you coordinate all these teams? My experience is that when you've got lots of little teams, each owning a particular part of the product, it becomes brittle. When the business wants to spend more attention over here than on over here, what are we going to do? Do we move people out of their team and onto a new team? That's very disruptive. Do we have to redesign the organization every time we do that? That's even more disruptive. Do we deal with the fact that this team doesn't want to work on something else? It's not, it's not impossible, but it is not perfect either. And you still end up with bottlenecks. So even though this is the approach that I have used for many years, I saw its flaws and I was looking for something better. And in 2018, I was at an open space conference with Ron Portell, and he told me about FAST, that's fluid scaling technology. And the fundamental thing about FAST that first grabs everybody's attention is that in FAST, you have the entire group of teams self-organize into their teams every 2 days. And that is pants on head crazy. That is just nuts. But it's inspired by open space technology and team self-organization, team self-selection. And I have experience with both of those things. Open space technology, if you haven't heard of it, is this really innovative conference approach where people design the conference in the first couple of hours of the conference. The agenda for the conference is created on the fly, and then people self-organize into who's going to speak and who's going to attend each thing. And if that sounds a little bit crazy, you just need to go to one, because these are amazing conferences to go to. They're incredibly energizing, and they tend to have topics that are of a lot of interest, because if they don't, you make a topic that's of interest to you and people show up to your topic. So I've had a lot of experience with open space technology, these open space conferences. I know that they work. And I've also used team self-selection to good effect. That company that I was working with that I've been talking about, at the end of the design work that we did, which was done in a very collaborative way with the rest of the organization, we figured out what all the teams were going to be, and we got in a big room, and this is it. Each table represents a team, and each balloon has the name of the team on it, which I've blocked out for confidentiality reasons for the most part here. And then people decided which team they were going to join by walking around the tables, seeing what the teams needed, and sitting down at those tables. They made that decision based on their skills, their interests, who they wanted to work with, and what was best for the organization. Now, it doesn't just happen. There was a lot of preparation work that went into that, saying this is the kinds of skills we need and so forth. But what I found is that this team self-selection, it works really well. The teams are excited to work together. And to use a bit of a consultant cliche, and I am a consultant, I have to apologize, they hit the ground running. They're really excited to work together, and they just go out the gate. So I knew team self-selection could work. I know open space technologies work. And I heard this idea of we've got FAST where teams self-select every couple of days. And I thought, this is crazy. But it's crazy like extreme programming was crazy. When I first heard about extreme programming back in 1999, I thought, this is dumb. This could never work. I've got to try this. And I had the same reaction to fast. I don't know if this could possibly work, but I got to try it. And then in late 2021 and 2022, early 2022, I got the opportunity to do it. And that's what I want to tell you about. I want to tell you about my real world experience with FAST and how it turned out. So the fundamental construct, the fundamental thing you see in the FAST is the FAST meeting. Every couple of days, although this is entirely up to you. Oh, I should probably read this off. So FAST is a lightweight, simple to understand and simple to master method for organizing people around work that scales. You can find it at the FAST guide, which is at fastagile.io. And as I said, the fundamental structure of FAST is the FAST meeting every couple of days. Although you can make that at whatever cadence you like. We tried a week, and that was too long, so we went back to 2 days. Everybody gathers together in a room. Now, we were 100% remote, so our room was a Miro board. And you get everybody together in the room, and then the folks who are in charge of product direction, in our case, it was the executives for this 45-person group, they put down the current organizational objectives on the wall, or in our case, on the Miro board. They explain how the business priorities have changed since the last time you did this, which was just 2 days ago. And then the people who are doing the work, the entire group is called a collective. It's a collection of teams. The people in the collective say, I want to steward a team. I want to lead a team to work on this thing. So people volunteer to lead a team, and these folks are called team stewards. And what they choose to work on is entirely up to them. It is most often one of the features or valuable increments that the business priorities are related to the business priorities. But it can also be things like, we need to improve our test automation. I've got some concerns about performance. I want to lead a team to do performance testing. We can be faster if we have some more build automation. Anything that the people on the ground think is going to move the ball forward and be the most important thing to do to move the ball forward, that's what they volunteer to lead a team to do. And then you limit the number of teams based on the number of folks you have. I would suggest probably about 1 team per 5 people. So we had a maximum of 8 teams in this organization. And then people volunteer to join the teams. In person, they just physically move over to where the team is. And in a remote environment, you have a sticky with your name on it, and you drag that onto the team that you want to join. And that is pretty much all there is to FAST. Every 2 days, you get together and you have this meeting and you decide what you're going to work on. You join a team to work on it. It takes 20 minutes. So your entire overhead for FAST is 40 minutes a week. And that's pretty amazing. Now, one thing I want to clarify is that FAST is not a sprint-based approach. What these teams are working on is just what they're going to be doing over the next couple of days. They're not committing to finishing anything. They're not committing to, have a solution. They're just saying, we're going to work on this. And after 2 days, if it's not done, maybe there'll be another team that continues working on that. It's not a sprint. It's more like a continuous flow or Kanban approach. This here is the board that we used in that organization in the FAST meeting. What you see on the top is the team's working agreements. You can't read it in this slide, but it says, we work together best when, and it has the 5 sort of key working agreements for the collective. Then you have the valuable increments that the collective is working on. A valuable increment is something that you can ship to market that brings value to the organization in some way. Not necessarily to market. It's something that you can do that brings value to the organization and can be shipped and be done. And then that has sort of Kanban-esque in that you have complete on the left and what's coming up on the right. And then below that, you have a box for each team, and you can see the little orange stickies which had people's names on them. You're, of course, going to customize FAST to the needs of your organization, and this organization was no exception. What we had to do to customize it for this organization was kind of complicated and not what I would recommend for you. So the starting point I'd recommend for people who are new to FAST is actually much more straightforward. You're going to have your continuous flow board, your Kanban style board, which says, this is what we've done in the last cycle. This is what is currently in progress, and this is what's coming up next. And you can limit the work in progress on those to whatever degree you think is appropriate, but I would recommend keeping it as small as possible. And then below that, we've got a box for each team, what the team's going to focus on. So what the steward says this team is going to be doing, and then who's actually on the team. We've got a spot for the steward, which is right down here. And we've got, slide this out of the way, spot for the steward here, and then the people who have joined the team here. So that's what the fast board looks like, and that's what the fast meeting looks like. There's generally a lot of questions, so I've got time set aside in this talk to take questions, but there's a couple of common questions that I know always come up, so I'm going to address the first one of those first. But I don't know how y'all, I haven't actually had my chat open. I think if you have questions, I will just, when the time comes, I'll just stop and ask, but if you want to toss a question in the chat now, I'll be happy to take those as well. But before I start answering questions, the most common question I get is, every 2 days forming new teams, isn't that really wasteful? And the answer is, it doesn't actually work out that way. People tend to stay together. They tend to stay on the same team. What I'm going to show you here, this diagram is a visualization of how people move between teams over the first couple of months of working together in this fast organization, in this fast team. Each row is a fast meeting, and you can see they occurred every couple of days. In the beginning, it was literally every 2 days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. But fairly quickly, we went to a Monday, Thursday cadence. So people would work Monday, Tuesday, then we'd have Wednesday for meetings and for what we called sharpen the saw time. So self-education and improvement. And then Thursday, Friday was the next fast cycle. The solid line, each vertical line represents a continuing flow of work on a particular valuable increment. And each horizontal line is, again, one fast meeting. The new buttons mean that we've started work on a new valuable increment. The green check marks means that the valuable increment has been finished and shipped. And the skull means that it was abandoned for some reason. Later on, you're going to see that there's a couple cases where a valuable increment was blocked and people couldn't work on it anymore, typically because we were waiting for stakeholder feedback. The solid lines show how people moved between teams. This is voluntary movement between teams. There were some cases where people went on vacation or went to join the ops rotation, the on-call ops rotation, and I haven't visualized those because it makes the diagram hard to read. But for the most part, the solid lines represent when people move between teams. And what you're going to see here is that in the first couple of weeks, yeah, there was a lot of movement between teams as people worked it out. But over time, what you're seeing here is that people pretty much stayed on the same team, except when a team finished its work or when a new chunk of work started and their expertise was needed on that team. I also want you to notice how many green checkboxes there were. Before we started, it took about 2 to 3 months for them to ship stuff. And now they're finishing valuable increments multiple times per week. I also want to call out here in this meeting, I didn't trace it out further. Creating this diagram was a huge amount of work. So I have actually many more months of data, but I haven't visualized it yet. But one thing I notice here is that this team here, even though they finished their work, they pretty much all moved together onto the next feature they were going to work on. And that's what I'd expect from a mature fast team, is that people do stay together, but for the most part, but you also see them moving around as new stuff starts and their expertise is needed. So this is starting, so you've got somebody moving on to this team, somebody moving off to work over here, but for the most part, people are sticking together. I'm going to sort of recap the fast self-selection, and then I'm going to pause for questions. I do have another couple of sections for how planning and idea flow worked, and also how teams coordinated with all these folks coming and leaving. And we'll get to that in a bit. But first, just to summarize, the core fast structure, this core mechanic of a fast meeting that takes about 20 minutes twice a week, that worked really well. This was actually kind of a torture test for fast, in that This was a group of people who were all siloed. They'd all been working individually for sort of stakeholders who would come and sit on their desk and say, "Can you do this thing for me?" They were being asked to work as a team in a way that they'd never done before. They also had dozens and dozens and dozens of products, way more products than they even had people, and way more stakeholders than they had people. So it was sort of classic IT where they had just way too much work to do. Despite that, it was really easy for them to adopt. It took about 2 weeks to get through the initial chaos, although we did do a lot of preparation work beforehand to sort of lay the groundwork and figure out whether FAST was actually a good fit for this company. It was very low overhead, and we absolutely saw the people moving to where the work needed, just like they were supposed to, and that was very successful. On the downside, people were kind of used to a cargo cult Scrum approach to Agile, very much in the mindset of we sign up for something and that's a commitment to deliver. That's not how fast work. It's just a 2-day checkpoint, and people struggled with that. There was a huge amount of work in this organization. Everybody was siloed, so people had trouble ramping up to unfamiliar work, and they had no experience working as collaborative teams, and that was a challenge for them. I think that other than that first one, the unfamiliar work in the collaborative teams was more a consequence of the environment than FAST itself, but it is a pretty typical thing you see in organizations, so it's something to keep an eye on if you try FAST. The pressure to deliver, that's something I think you're likely to see from folks that are switching from a Scrum or iteration-based, sprint-based environment, so it's definitely something to keep an eye on. It did resolve itself over time, but it was a challenge in the beginning. We were reiterating pretty much every single FAST meeting. You're not making a commitment. Please put less pressure on yourself in these first couple of months. The goal of the business is for you to learn how to do this well, not to deliver the most possible. But even despite reiterating that and having the executives reiterate that every single FAST meeting, it was still something where people were putting a lot of pressure on themselves, and we had to manage. So that is introduction to the core ideas in FAST. I'm going to pause for questions. I'm going to take some of the questions in the chat, but you're also welcome to use the little hand raise button in Zoom, and I'll call on you as well. So to start off, a question from Jade. Did the team's demo progress or completed work during the collective meeting? So after the changes to the business goals were described, each steward from the previous cycle would say, "This is what our team worked on." It'd be basically a sentence or two. There was some conversation about doing demos of completed work when the work was completed. Typically, in a single cycle, you're not going to actually ship something. But there was so much self-pressure that people were putting on themselves early on when the first team delivered something. We are like, "Yay, celebration." And a lot of people got upset about that. They were like, "But we didn't finish anything." So we really cut way back on the celebrations, which I think is a little sad. But that's something that we did in that organization for their context. Jade also asked, can you talk a little bit about how the team self-organized around their needs? So the fundamental guideline that we had on the Miro board was do what's best for company name. And that was, the first priority. And these were folks who were very dedicated to doing a good job. And that's, I think, why they put a lot of pressure on themselves. So we did not have any problems with that. What people were looking at in practice as they were joining teams was, number one, does this team, do I have knowledge this team needs? And would I be more effective here than somewhere else? Which is why you did see people moving when a new team would start up, you'd see people move into that. And part of the reason that needed to happen was because there was a lot of knowledge silos. So those often, for any particular new idea, there was one person in the organization, at least in the beginning, who knew how to do that thing. And so they needed to be the one who was on that team. But other than that, people would tend to self-organize based on who they wanted to work with. Even though there were only 45 people in this organization, there were still interpersonal conflicts. And there wasn't really good people management in this organization. So there wasn't a lot of coaching around interpersonal conflicts, which I think was a gap in their management skill set. But FAST made that tractable because rather than being assigned to work with somebody they just couldn't get along with, people would join teams with people they could work well with. And I thought that was something that worked well. And it was not, none of this was assigned. People were aware of their skills. They were aware of what needed to be done, because it was described by the steward. I'm going to form a team to work on this. I need people who know how to do this sort of thing. And they would seamlessly move into those places as needed. It worked very similarly. Again, feel free to, if you'd like to not have me be the only one talking, I'd love to take actual questions. So feel free to raise your hand, but I'm just going to keep running down this list here. D. Crawley, I think that's Dennis. Am I right there? He says, what's the definition of success in this process? Can you say a little bit more about that?
So what's it doesn't, so they don't work in sprints. Are they delivering working software? I mean, how do they know if they're being successful? Maybe it's too broad of a question, and I don't know. I just
Yeah. So each of these pink stickies that you're seeing here, each of these is a valuable increment, and a valuable increment is something that the collective can deliver that brings value to the organization.
Okay.
So I'll talk about it more when I get into idea flow, but each valuable increment had a definition of why it was important and what it meant for it to be done. Mostly that was about delivering some sort of value to the team stakeholders. This was a business intelligence organization, so they were delivering reports and data analysis to their stakeholders. But in some cases, it was learning value. So we want to learn, what are our costs around this, or how can we do this? And in some cases, it might be options value. We want to have the option to switch to a new technology, even if we don't actually pull the trigger on that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Diane, the tool we used to track this was Miro, and what you're seeing here is actual screenshots from the tool that have been sanitized, so to take out confidential information. So this is what our board actually looked like on Miro. Larry, you're the next. Why don't you speak, because I need to rest my voice for a moment. So can you ask the question?
Sure. So I'm assuming that each team is contributing to a composite solution. Basically, each team has, I don't know what the right terminology is, but in one scaling model, they call it feature. So in using that term, each of the teams is working on maybe a feature that will contribute to the overall solution. It seems like there should be some kind of planning to coordinate when one will be done, if there's dependencies and that sort of thing. Yeah. I'm sure there is some planning done in here. I just don't see where that's done.
Yeah, that's what, when I'm trying to talk about idea flow, that's where we're going to talk about how that planning is done. Each team would tend to work on a single valuable increment. Because this was an organization where people were used to working pretty much in isolation as individuals, just getting to the point where they could work as an effective collaborative team was a real challenge for them. I think, and also because this was a business intelligence organization with a lot of stakeholders, it didn't make sense to have multiple teams focus on the same valuable increment at the same time. In a more traditional product-oriented environment, I would like to see multiple teams collaborating on a single valuable increment, but that wasn't really a good idea in this situation. And
a follow-on question to that. Sorry, if that is the case, and Miro board is essentially the status of the overall effort, how is this reported to the stakeholders? How do they know how we're doing as a group?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question when we get to idea flow as well.
Okay.
But basically the department, which was 45 people, included several executives, and they looked directly at the boards, and that's how they had transparency. Their stakeholders, who were like the clinical directors at hospitals, they didn't care what the team was working on. They just cared about when they were going to get their stuff. And they were what they called PMPOs, product managers and product owners, that sort of acted as that interface to those stakeholders. And so they would just communicate directly, this is what's going on.
Great, thanks.
I'm going to answer one more question from the list, and then I'm a little worried about running out of time, so I'm going to move on. Just to double check, Janet, we've got about 50 minutes left. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
that's about right, James. You're good.
Okay. Well, I got a whole bunch more stuff, so I want to make sure we have time to get through it all. But to answer the next question, do you know organizations that use this? Yeah. So Ron Quartel's company was a health insurance organization. The company I was working with was actually a large hospital network in the U.S. with hundreds of locations and tens of thousands of employees. But the group I was working with was 45 people at the time I worked with. Now, all of the business intelligence in that organization was combined into one group. So they now have several hundred people. And perhaps because of the success they had with this, the people who were in charge of this business intelligence group actually ended up in charge of the larger combined group. But when they combined, they went through a lot of organizational trauma, I might say, and they're still recovering from that. So they don't really have a process right now. They're sort of working it out. And a lot of people are just doing what they used to do. I think that I actually just talked to my contact at the company last week. And he thinks that over the next 3 to 6 months, they're going to sort of start to shake out and get things back to normal. So I might have new things to report in another 6 months. Okay, so I'm going to move on to idea flow. The reason I included this is because people always ask, how is the planning done in this environment? How do we plan all the work that needs to be done? And the reality is that first, every organization I've worked with has needed their own customized design for the way they do this large scale planning. And second, it's not really specific to FAST. It's something that you need to create. It cannot be, there's no one size fits all. And the way the work that's done sort of plugs into the output of the way the planning is done, if that makes sense. But I'm going to share it anyway, because it was an important part of the work we did together, and it will help you get an idea of how this all fits together. So fundamentally what we did in the FAST guide, Ron Quartel recommends using story maps. That's Jeff Patton's story mapping technique. We used an approach from my book, which is actually recently out in a second edition, The Art of Agile Development, called chartering. And chartering has multiple components. And the first component of that is vision. Actually, we use chartering and visual planning. In the chartering part, you've got vision, mission, and indicators as sort of your overarching, this is the direction that we're going. So what you're seeing here is a real sanitized screenshot of the charter for one of the product areas that this organization worked with. We've got the vision, mission, and indicators here on the left.
Yeah,
And we
James,
have
we're not seeing your screen.
You're not seeing my screen?
No,
No.
we're not.
You probably lost it when I jumped between slides. Thank you for telling me.
Okay,
Good now?
That's great.
Okay, yeah. So what you're seeing here, vision, mission, and indicators on the left, and a context diagram on the right. The context diagram has the collective in the center, and then all the stakeholders for this particular product area, all extending around that. And the arrows show inflows and outflows. What do they need from us, and what do we need from them? We also had visual plans, which is what are all the valuable increments that we're going to deliver related to this charter. And there are multiple ways of doing that. Again, story mapping is a common one. We used an approach called cluster mapping, which is sort of a free-form version of story maps. We break the ideas down into valuable increments, and then we cluster them according to where things are related to each other. And this was repeated for every area that the team had. And because they had a real strategic planning problem that was outside of their control, this was what their real plan looked like. We repeated that charter and that visual planning for each area. And you can see they have over a dozen different areas to deal with. All of this with 45 people and probably about 25 engineers. Honestly, it's way, way too much work for the size organization that they had. And so for each of those valuable increments, the PMPOs that were sort of spearheading that particular product area, they would choose which valuable increments are most important to do first, and they would all get together with the executives and they would prioritize them with something they called the Medusa diagram. Each of these horizontal rows on the right is one of the product areas, one of the stakeholder areas that they're trying to address. And each area gets one valuable increment that gets to be at the front of the queue. And then all of that's broken down even further. 25% of the time they were spending on their sponsors' priorities, 50% of the time they're spending on their sponsors' priorities, 25% of the time they're spending on departmental priorities, and 25% of the time was spent on quick wins. That's things that had good political impact and weren't very expensive to develop. And so even this, which is like, what's the highest priority thing for a particular area, even that had to get winnowed down even further into the maybe 8 priorities that went into the FAST meeting. So once they were ready to start, they were pulled from that, this is ready to go, put into the FAST meeting. You can see we've got the ready to start or resume here. That's what's up next. We've got the work that's actually in progress here. Our work in progress limit was no more than 8, but in reality, the FAST teams chose when they were going to take on something new rather than work on something that was in progress. So it wasn't always filled up all the way to 8. And when a FAST team started on a particular valuable increment, it would move into the in progress section, and that would be reflected on the Medusa diagram back for visibility to executives and stakeholders as needed. So to summarize how this worked, we have chartering for a given stakeholder area, which clarifies the purpose and context of what we're going to do for that stakeholder area, typically with a mission that is on the order, in theory, on the order of 3 to 6 months, but in practice, because they were so overloaded, I think it ended up being longer than that. Then we had visual planning to say, well, this is how we're going to actually accomplish that mission. Prioritization, where the executives filtered through all this and said, well, this is what we're actually going to do next. The execs would identify a product manager who would prepare the increment for development. That meant going out and talking to stakeholders and really understanding it. And then it goes into that ready to start bucket and waits for a team to have bandwidth to finish up their existing stuff, and for a steward to select and say, I'm ready to lead a team to start a new thing. And they would pull it off of that ready to start queue. And then they would work on it, and then it would be released. This worked really well with a couple of caveats. Biggest thing was that everybody, not just the execs, everybody had total transparency into what was going on and what their priorities were. And this was repeatedly told. I was repeatedly told after checking with them after we were all done, after I was done with them, that this was a major component of success for them. It solved the poor strategic prioritization problem to the degree that it could. Again, that was coming from outside the organization. It was the soup they lived in. There wasn't much they could do about it, but it did address it. It would have been better if we didn't have to address it, but it addressed it to the degree that we could. Prior to doing this, we had a lot of PM as a stakeholder come sit on their head. The PM would go sit on an engineer's head, and the engineer would do the work. This reduced that quite a bit, and it was very easy to adjust priorities. We also had some design in there that I didn't talk about that was intended to put PMs together in pairs. However, the PMs in this organization were very much zero-sum game focused. If they were going to win, somebody else had to lose. They were not very collaborative. So I don't think that happened, but we put in some design to try to address it. The downside was, though, because PMs felt there was a lot of fear from the PMs in this organization about not being relevant anymore. If the engineers are deciding for themselves what they're going to do, what's my job? And so there was a whole lot of this is my area. Nobody else is going to touch this. And again, that zero-sum game thinking. And so as a result of this, to address that concern, we gave the PMs very clear areas of responsibility, but they shut the engineers out of those areas of responsibility. So as where before an engineer would maybe work on a single set of products, maybe 5, 10 products for a particular set of stakeholders, and would work with a PM to talk to those stakeholders. Now the PMs were saying, no, my job is to talk to the stakeholders. Engineers, you do the engineering work. I don't think this was a fast problem, but it was a consequence of putting more design around it. PMs still struggle with following the rules, and it didn't address the root issue that there was just way too much stuff to do. So that's idea flow. Again, I'll be answer some more questions on that. I don't see any new questions in the chat, so let me pause for a second and ask you to raise hands if you have questions about how idea flow works. While y'all are thinking about that, let me take a couple more questions that came up about the previous segment. From Nikolai, what happens if nobody volunteers to work on an important component? That's a really common concern about team self-selection that has never been true in my experience. And self-selection, everybody understands that there's some scut work that has to be done. People volunteer to work on it, and then will often say, I don't want to work on it this time. Can somebody else do it? It just isn't an issue. I have not seen it be a problem. Particularly in this organization, there was a really strong desire to succeed and do good work on the part of everybody, and particularly the engineers. And so the work just, people just signed up for the work that needed to be done. We did have a little bit of an issue in the beginning with people wanting to volunteer to work on the sexy stuff. There was some machine learning and data and sort of data science stuff happening, but that stopped fairly quickly, partly because the work was interesting, but the teams weren't great to work on. So it actually ended up that people wanted to work on a good team more than they wanted to work on a particular type of work. Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And good to see you. Hi. The idea flow bits, the sessions with executives and stakeholders and such, how were those happening on a cadence? Like how often? And were they happening in between bouts of teams working on work, or were they in a totally parallel track separate from the developers?
It was in parallel track, and I think that's part of why we had this problem with unintentionally reducing engineer ownership. So this was a very unusual organization. It was about 45 people, and they had 5 executives. They had 12 or 13 PMPOs, and they had 20-something engineers that were split among front-end visualization, data visualization engineers, data engineers who had a lot of database experience, and then some data scientists and ML specialists. It was not an organization with a strong tradition of software engineering. It was more, like I said, data visualization. Part of the reason for that structure, I think there was some historical, as they grew, there was just a need to manage a lot of the stakeholders. So they were kind of top heavy on the manager side of things, the product management side of things. Oh, and with all this, they had one engineering manager who really acted more like an architect. They did not want to do people management. And this was part of why the organization struggled with interpersonal issues, because they just didn't have any coaching, interpersonal coaching happening in the organization. But part of the reason for this lopsided structure, it's not as silly as it might seem. This is a heavily domain-specific environment. What they're doing is data visualizations for medical directors at hospital clinics and other similar types of situation. So a lot of domain expertise was required, and that's what the product managers were doing. The executives in the organization were mostly doctors, people with an MD, and the best PMs were used to be nurses or had worked as one of the PMs was a nurse who had actually worked as a medical director. So that's why it was so lopsided. So what these folks are doing as people are working in teams, the PMPOs would join teams and help, help say, well, this is what's important to get this work done. But they're also going out and they're talking to stakeholders and sort of prepping things to get ready for a team to start working on it. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, they're working in parallel, Marcus. Did I answer your question?
Very much so. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, you got to watch out. Once I start talking, it's hard to stop me. There's another comment in the chat I want to address. Larry asked, is each team sprint time the same start date, same end date for every 2-day sprint? They were called value cycles in FAST because they're not sprints. It's really, the FAST meeting is just a checkpoint. And yeah, the FAST meetings was at 9:30 on Mondays and Thursdays, and it lasted for half an hour. Actually, I think they may have moved it earlier once they got a team in India joining the collective. But it was scheduled for half an hour. It was typically done after about 20 minutes. And the previous cycle ends at the beginning of the FAST meeting, and the next cycle begins at the end of the FAST meeting. So it just, FAST meeting is the checkpoint, and everybody attends the FAST meeting.
Thank you.
Okay. Poonam asks, who facilitated the idea flow? So there was one of the PMs after we did this work, they actually, they ended up being kind of the coach for the organization, taking over the role that I was playing as I rolled off. And they had an assistant who was also a PM, and they were the ones who facilitated the FAST meeting. FAST meeting, you're doing this every 2 days. It does not take very long for people to get extremely experienced with it. So it didn't need a lot of facilitation, but there is a little bit of, hey, here's, it became a useful place to share news. So here's the news of the day. Executive X, can you share how the business priorities have changed? They haven't changed in the last 2 days. Steward Y, what happened during your value cycle? They spend a couple of moments saying a sentence or two. They point to the next person, and then they say, can you volunteer? Who's going to volunteer to be a steward this time? And it continues on in that way. Okay. Another question that often comes up is, how does, so we've got people who are joining teams potentially every couple of days. The teams are mostly stable, but you do have folks moving around as new work starts, and as new, particularly in this organization, let's say we're moving from doing some of the data design, and we're starting to do the visualization. Well, now we need a data visualization engineer to join the team. So there are people coming and leaving the teams even as a valuable increment is being worked upon. So the question is, how is that work coordinated? And the answer is, once again, through a visualization. On the Miro board, each valuable increment that was in progress had a board that looked something like this. What you see here, and I've redacted the living crap out of this. So all this is been sanitized. But what you see is, this is what we're going to be working on. This is some important things to know. Here's some of the scheduling that's important around it. Here's some of the flow of the way the data happens. And here in the middle is what everybody's working on. This is called a discovery tree. A discovery tree is a just-in-time hierarchical breakdown of the work that needs to be done for any given valuable increment. It's really just a outline. So if I take a completely made up example, let's say we're going to plan getting ready for work in the morning. We're going to say, well, first we're going to wake up, then we're going to get presentable, and then we're going to eat breakfast. And then to get presentable, we have to do each of these things. Well, that's all this discovery tree is. We take that hierarchy, that outline, and we turn it on its side, and we may put it in a tree. And that's all there is to it. Now, I said it's a just-in-time breakdown of the work. We don't actually break down the work until we start working on it. So the valuable increment is get ready for work, and it's got these 3 pieces, and that's all the work we do in terms of planning to start with. Then when somebody wants to work on it, they choose a task. They're not necessarily have to be done in order. they turn that task yellow, and they put an icon on it, which represents them. This is something that teams sort of generated on their own. They all came up with little fun icons, and they'd put a little key up in the corner saying this icon equals this person. So when somebody chose a task, they mark it yellow. This task is in progress. They put their icon on it. And then if it was more than a couple of hours of work, they would break it down. Oh, I'm jumping ahead. Then when it was done, they'd mark it green. They'd move their icon to the next task they're working on, and so on. If the task is more than a couple of hours of work, they break it down into subsets of tasks. And then they would work on those until they were done. And then when all the tasks were done, they'd mark the parent green, and they would erase the ones underneath it. So in this way, the discovery tree is a living description of what is it that we know needs to be done to make progress on this valuable increment right now. And of course, there's not just one person working on this, it's everybody who's working on it puts their sticky on it. And so working in that way continues until all the tasks are done and the overall valuable increment is done. And when the valuable increment is done, it's erased. It's no longer relevant. The whole thing is retired. They also used Azure DevOps, which is a name I don't love, but Microsoft's planning tool, Azure DevOps, was used to record information that they wanted to preserve for the future. But the discovery tree was used as this is our current state. So the results of this was it did have a good lightweight view into the work, gave people the ability to see what everyone was working on, but it didn't work well. I think, going back and looking at it several months later, I think they did finally get the hang of it, but the teams really struggled with this discovery tree idea. They were used to working in Azure DevOps, and they were used to working in a way where the PMs would sort of break everything down and feed it to them, sort of classic assign me a ticket type of work. And what we were asking them to do is be responsible for their own work. So there was a lot of confusion about it. They had a really hard time breaking the work down into small tasks. They would, previous to this, have tasks that were a couple of weeks long. So idea of breaking it down so small was really foreign. Early on, what they would do is they would take the valuable increment and they would build out the entire discovery tree, like every single leaf, every possible thing that could be done, which of course is a lot of work and would be wrong because you can't predict that far in ahead. And when the work was finished, they had a really hard time erasing it. The discovery tree is supposed to represent this is what's happening right now. But because there was this sort of odd culture in the organization of I need to prove my worth, people would sort of use it as a way of saying, hey, here's what I want to do. And I think related to that, they'd build out the whole discovery tree, and then somebody would say, well, I want to work on this, 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 and this. And they put their sticky on everything they wanted to work on, rather than saying, this is what I'm working on right now. So I really like the discovery tree, but it didn't work well for us. And I've noticed in general, people seem to struggle with it. So next time I do fast, I'm going to try the discovery tree one more time, but I'm not going to try it real hard. And if people have the same sort of confusion again, I'm going to use a different technique. Visual task planning is what's in my book, and I've had a lot of success with that. I'll probably just do that. So that's the overall view of discovery trees. The other question about, how are new people brought up to speed? When somebody new joins the team steward would be responsible for deciding, helping them get up to speed. And that would either be taking a little bit of time to just explain to them what was going on, or asking somebody to volunteer to pair with that person to bring them up to speed. Each team steward got to choose how the team would work together over the course of the 2 days that they were working. And the reason for that was to give people an opportunity to experiment and to allow the best ideas to sort of filter throughout the organization, which did in fact happen. So that's discovery trees. That is the third sort of major piece of what I have to present here. The FAST meeting is the core mechanic for FAST. Idea flow isn't specific to FAST, but it's how the planning was done. And you're going to want to design that for your specific situation. And then discovery trees are how people coordinated as the work was happening. Discovery tree showed you what is currently in progress, what's up next, and who's working on each thing as we're working on it. I'll pause to take questions again, and then we'll go into our conclusion. So we've got a fair amount of time for questions. So if there are more questions, feel free to bring them up.
James, I had a question. Given the model, what was the experience with task switching, folks switching teams? It sounds like it was fairly minimal because people were staying on the teams, but wasn't there kind of a tax to pay with the with task switching?
A little bit, but remember, people are deciding for themselves which team to join. And so one of the reasons they would stay with the same team is because they'd form a certain amount of expertise in a particular thing that was being worked on. And so they'd want to maintain that. And so they would stick through it. But they did have problems because remember, they had more product areas to serve than they actually had engineers in the organization. So one thing that they really struggled with is that it was very difficult for people to keep track, to have all the knowledge needed to work on everything this organization needed. And I think that was not so much because they were changing teams, but because there was just too much to do. Does that answer your question, Steve?
Yeah, it does, James. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Marcus asks in the chat, I'm curious which Miro widgets the group used for their discovery trees. This was actually just the basic built-in stuff to Miro.
Just stickies or boxes and lines then?
Yeah, let me show you the actual component. So everything you see here is just the built-in Miro tooling. The stickies are Miro sticky notes, and the lines are the arrow function, which you click the arrow, you click the source sticky, you click the destination sticky, and then you can tell it to do 90-degree angles, and that's pretty much all there is to it.
Cool.
Any other questions about really any aspect of FAST while I've got this up?
I'm curious too, you mentioned the teams became stable-ish over time.
Mm-hmm.
Did the steward role did the same person tend to steward something all the way through or most of the way through, or did that rotate much?
So we had some really interesting dynamics there. One of the challenges for me in this organization, I think because it was composed of doctors, and I'm going to generalize a little bit, is they were very confident in their ability to do everything themselves and to have all the answers. So I wasn't hired to do all the things I did from the beginning. They originally hired me to do training on Agile planning. And part of that was saying, well, if you're going to have Agile planning, you need to have Agile teams. And a team is going to have a charter. And I said, so have you designed your teams? And that's a challenge with a large scale environment like you have. I can help you with that. And they're like, no, we got it. And then, so we did the beginning of the training. I said, now, before we can do more training, you need to have your teams defined. And I said, great. And then a month later, hey, can you help us define your teams? And then, that went on and that went on and that went on. So I wasn't able to do everything I wanted to do. And one of the things that I wasn't able to do is I wasn't able to do any team level coaching. I was mostly working with the executives and the product managers, teaching them, and a change team to define the structure and to help them put it into place, but not coach the individual teams about how to work effectively as a team. And because they didn't have that coaching from me, and they didn't have any people managers who wanted to do people management, and because they had this environment where people were very individualistic, they struggled quite a bit with learning to work together as a team. I think that's going to be true in any team-based transition you do, whether it's fast or Scrum or Safe or something else. But it's quite possible that having the teams move around or having the teams be flexible made that more difficult. At the same time, having people be able to move between teams really helped address their interpersonal issues, because people could avoid the folks that they didn't work well with. And to get back to your question about the steward, so that's all a very long-winded ramp up too. Some of the teams were really effective about that, and some were not. There was one person who was very socially inept, who was absolutely who's the only person who knew how to do a particular valuable increment, and was the only person who was willing to be steward on that, and would sort of browbeat the other people on the team. And again, they didn't have the capacity or the skill in the organization to address that interpersonal issue. But another team, and what I saw from, it was really just one team that had that issue, and they also tended to stay together, which was interesting. But the other teams were also tended to move around more and were more egalitarian. Like I saw a case where the team stayed together, but they actually encouraged each other to take the steward role in rotation. So I did it this time, now you do it. Like they saw it as an opportunity to gain some leadership skills. And that was more of what I would like to see in this environment.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions before I wrap up?
I had one other question. Did they have any on-call?
They did. They had an on-call ops rotation. So another thing that was interesting about this organization was that they had, I think you could really divide their engineering expertise into 4 categories. They had visualization engineers. They had data engineers who were really, SQL folks. And the visualization engineers knew how to use Tableau and to make it work well. They had machine learning specialists who were data scientists who really didn't, like, they wrote papers and presented at conferences, and they didn't participate very much in the rest of the process. And well, one of them did, one of them didn't. And because they were hard to come by and we didn't want to alienate them, we just sort of let that be, let the people who wanted to exclude themselves from the process exclude themselves. And then we had ops. The ops folks were probably the only ones with sort of an engineering mindset, whereas the visualization engineers and the data engineers were more focused on getting stuff done, to put it charitably, than on design or how do we create high quality systems. As a result, there was kind of this us versus them, we're smarter than everybody else coming from the ops folks. And of course, the ops folks were of the on-call rotation, and they had to put up with the bad design that came from the other folks, which made that us versus them even more challenging. So they were kind of burned out. They were exhibiting a symptom I see a lot, which I call angry ops syndrome, which is where the ops are overloaded because of stuff they're responsible for something or accountable for something that they don't have responsibility to create themselves. And the person who was sort of their tech lead was very abrasive, had a very abrasive personality. So I put her on the change team and had her be part of the design. And a part of the reason it took us 4 months to design this thing is because she was fighting us tooth and nail every step of the way. But we did end up creating a design that she was happy with. And the way it ended up was that the ops folks had a 3-person on-call rotation that happened every week. And when people were on call, they exited the team that they were on. And when they weren't on call, they could join a team. That answer your question, Jade?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that approach of having when folks are on call, they just don't join a team. I actually think that it worked out pretty well. But again, I didn't get a chance to do team level coaching except for just a very small amount. So I didn't get to see how that worked out in practice.
Can I ask another question? What
Yeah.
about like bugs or other sorts of like work that would come up? Like how did that get like
So that's
distributed or
that's
that
an
sort of thing?
interesting question. That's actually a part of the idea flow I didn't mention. Because the organization was historically so siloed, there was a lot, and because it was a a business intelligence organization, there were some things that had to be done on a schedule. that, new data has come in for this report, it has to be updated, and only one person knows how to do it. So the design we put around that was that anything that takes less than a couple of hours can interrupt a team. Like, you can just go to the team and say, hey, I've got this thing, can you please just take care of it? And those reports and so forth, if they could be identified in advance, they'd be assigned to the team that had the person who knew how to do that. The idea was that through collective ownership, the people who knew how to do that work would pair with somebody and they would do it together and start spreading the knowledge around the organization. I don't think that ever happened. I had to take kind of a light touch in some of this because I wasn't doing any team level coaching. So team stewards had total control over how their teams did their work. I mentioned pairing and mobbing multiple times. There were no bites whatsoever. So I think that silo around who can do, the reports, I think that stuck for quite a while. I never went back and checked on that. So I don't know if they did see a lot of knowledge transfer over time, but I don't know if that was one of those things. Bugs were similar. If there was a bug that came up and it could be resolved in just an hour or two, they would just, the person who found it would go to the person they thought that could take care of it, and they would just take care of it. Anything larger than that just went through the normal fast process. We've got this thing, we need it taken care of. Somebody volunteers to steward a team to take care of it. Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that they had been going weeks or months between like shipping things prior to this, and got to where there were green check marks almost every fast meeting. Did those check marks represent a deployment to production every time, or what did done really mean in that case?
Done for a valuable increment meant we are getting the value from this thing. So yeah, it did mean actual deployment.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go into the conclusion. So I have to stop my slides, otherwise we're going to have to go through all those animations again. One moment. So my work with this company started in early 2021, and we didn't really start working on the organizational design work until about mid 2021. Remember that I wasn't originally hired to do this. It sort of discovered the need over time. The design work took about 4 months, and the first fast meeting happened in October. I continued working with them on a decreasing level of involvement until about March of 2022. And then 6 months later, and every 3 months since then, I've gotten back in touch with the executive who I've been working with most and saying, what's happened? What have you learned? What can I learn from you? And I want to share with you what the conclusions from that were. After 9 months, and the most recent check-in I just had with them, which would be 12 months later, after 9 months, they got reorganized. And so there's not a lot to learn there. We've got to wait for them the fallout to settle out from that before I can share new conclusions. But after 6 months, they had a really solid implementation of FAST and so could draw some pretty strong conclusions from it. I've put them all here, but I'm just going to go through them. The biggest thing is that they did say that FAST has created a high degree of transparency. Everybody, not just the engineers, not just the executive, but everybody in the organization in that 45-person department had a really good understanding of what was going on. And it was very successful at matching the people to the work that needed to be done. So what that meant is that, particularly in this environment where priorities were changing all the time, they had the ability to do that, and people just flowed to work with it. FAST stands for Fluid Scaling Technology, and that fluid part of fluid scaling technology is absolutely 100% true. It really does create an environment where people can move to where the work needs to be done, because the people who are making the decision about who's going to work on what are the people who have the most expertise about what needs to be done. So that coordination problem that you see in other scaling mechanisms goes away because people coordinate for themselves. Um, it took them a long time to get to the point where they were good at working at a team, but they did tell me that after 6 months, so basically about a year from when they started, they gotten pretty good at it. And a pleasant surprise was that one of the goals was to improve the leadership and the engineering side. That did happen. Prior to FAST, all the leadership came from the PMPOs. And we actually restricted to help combat that. We said, for this organization, it's not a general FAST rule, but for this organization, the only people who could steward a team were allowed to be engineers. Only engineers could volunteer to steward. And that was because we knew that if we didn't do that, the PMs would just continue to take over. So we said the engineers have to be the ones to steward, and that worked. A real surprise to me is, when I was rolling off in March of 2022, the executive I was working on with said, we're seeing success, we're being asked to expand, and we have this team that's part of the organization that's in India that we want to have join us. And I said, well, long distance collaboration doesn't work. Probably what you need is another FAST team, another FAST collective, and then you can use the team topologies, make each one a stream aligned team, and you can coordinate in that way. Well, they're doctors and they didn't listen to me. And it's probably a good thing, because they said that it worked really well, that integrating those new engineers was super easy, despite there being a 12.5-hour time difference from the West Coast of the US, which is where most of these people are located. They said that they just joined the FAST team and they were the FAST meeting and then the FAST teams, and were pretty much immediately productive. So that was a pleasant surprise. They were still seeing issues related to larger organizational, what they called strategic, poor strategic planning. And I think that has less to do with FAST and more with the organization as a whole. So to wrap up, I would suggest trying FAST. I am absolutely going to do this again. This has been the most successful approach to scaling I've yet seen. And I've done a lot of scaling work, including that company I was talking about at the beginning. The time I worked with them, there were 300 people in their engineering department. I think if we had used FAST in that organization, we would have seen even better results, because rather than having 40 teams, which led to a real planning and coordination problem, we could have had 5 teams of 40 people each, rather than 40 teams of 5 people each. And I think that would have been more successful. It's really easy to incorporate specialties that you can't have on every team, because they just go where they're needed, when they're needed. It's very responsive to business needs, because again, people go where they're needed. It's resilient to people joining and leaving for the same reason. That said, this company had problems with collective ownership and team dynamics. I suspect that's more to do with the company than with FAST, but next time I try this, I'm going to keep a close eye on it and make sure that that we don't have trouble in that area. So to summarize, FAST is really characterized by the FAST meeting. You put the business goals on the wall, people volunteer to lead teams related to those business goals. Everybody self-selects onto those teams. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes twice a week, and it works really well, and I recommend it. That's it. Thanks for your time.
Awesome.
That was a great meeting.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Great job.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other questions before we wrap it up?
I took a lot of questions as we went, so
We did, that's true
just fun.
too. So James, we want to thank you, and also Elyson Group will be sending you a small honorarium for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Elyson
So
Group.
look forward to that. But again, really appreciate you joining us. Thank you on behalf of all of Agile Hartford, and we'll be sure to read the book.
All right. Yeah. Art of Agile Development, 2nd edition. It's got a goldfish on the cover. That's how you know it's good.
Nice. Great.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, James.
Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
great meeting,
night, everyone.
James.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Very interesting.